when you think about democracies dying, maybe you picture tanks in the streets, like Chile in 73, jets bombing the presidential palace. It's dramatic, violent.
Yeah, that's the classic image, isn't it?
Exactly. But, Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt argue something really quite different in their book, How Democracies Die. They say democracies can also just fade away quietly, not with a bang, but through the ballot box, a kind of slow, almost invisible subversion.
It's a really unsettling idea.
It is, and that's what we're going to unpack in this deep dive. We want to look at the lessons from history they lay out to help us understand the challenges, maybe the subtle ones, facing democracy today.
It's about spotting the signs, understanding those unwritten rules that, keep the whole thing running.
Right. So let's get into it. What does it actually mean for democracy to die from within, subtly, legally? How does that work?
Well, what's fascinating, and maybe a bit scary, is just how subtle it can be. Levitsky and Ziblatt use Venezuela as a key example. Even after Hugo Chavez had been chipping away at democratic norms for years, a survey in 2011 found, remarkably, that 51% of Venezuelans still thought their country was democratic.
Oh, half the people.
Yeah. It just shows how confusing it can be for the public when there isn't that single dramatic moment, like a coup.
The erosion is gradual, hard to see clearly sometimes.
It's such a contrast to the Cold War era, isn't it? Back then, the authors note something like 3 out of 4 democratic breakdowns were military coups. Argentina, Brazil, Turkey.
Classic examples. Overt force.
But more recently, you get leaders like Chavez in Venezuela. He was elected, right?
Yeah.
But then, step by step, he used supposedly legal means to undermine the system.
That's a playbook.
Like stalling that recall referendum, blacklisting people who signed the petition. What else did he do that fits this pattern?
Oh, there's a lot. He packed the Supreme Court with loyalists in 2004. That's a big one.
Then he got rid of presidential term limits. He steadily gained control over major media outlets. And the authors stress that even his 2012 re-election, while technically free, was deeply unfair because he used the whole state apparatus to his advantage.
And this veneer of legality you mentioned, that's crucial, isn't it?
Absolutely, because these actions often get approved by legislatures or rubber-stamped by the courts he just packed. They're often framed as necessary reforms, fighting corruption, cleaning up elections, that kind of thing.
So the alarm bells don't ring.
Exactly. Or at least not loudly enough. Anyone who calls out the abuse gets painted as, exaggerating or just being partisan, crying wolf.
Making it hard for people to realize the danger until it's quite advanced.
Precisely. It's not a sudden takeover. It's this methodical, often legal-seeming dismantling from the inside, using democracy's tools against itself.
Okay, so if it's that subtle, how can we spot these potential autocrats before they get into power? The political scientist Juan Linz came up with a kind of litmus test, didn't he?
Yes, and Levitsky and Ziblatt find it very useful. It gives us warning signs to look for.
What's the first one?
Well, the first key indicator is a weak commitment to democratic rules.
Meaning?
Like questioning the legitimacy of elections, refusing to accept defeat, suggesting the whole process is rigged.
The authors point to Donald Trump's comments before the 2016 election, suggesting he might not accept the result. That was pretty unprecedented for the U.S.
Highly unusual, yes.
Yeah.
It directly challenges the foundational agreement of democratic competition.
Okay, that's one. What's another warning sign from Linz's test?
Another big one is denying the legitimacy of political opponents.
So not just disagreeing with them, but...
Exactly. It's painting them as fundamentally illegitimate, calling them subversive, an existential threat, maybe even criminals who shouldn't be allowed to participate.
Like the lock-her-up chants directed at Hillary Clinton, which Trump seemed to encourage. The authors highlight that too.
That fits the pattern, yes. Dehumanizing the opposition makes it easier to justify actions against them later.
Right, and that connects to the third sign, doesn't it? Which is...
a toleration or encouragement of violence.
This isn't just theoretical, right?
No, it's about concrete actions. Having ties to armed groups, paramilitary organizations, or even just, winking at mob violence.
Levitsky and Ziblatt argue Trump was unusual in how he seemed to almost revel in the possibility of violence at his rallies, offering to pay legal fees for supporters who assaulted protesters.
Yeah, the codes are pretty stark. Knock the crap out of them. I'd like to punch him in the face. And that comment about Second Amendment people regarding potential Clinton Supreme Court picks.
Chilling stuff. Okay, so weak commitment to rules, denying opponents legitimacy, tolerating violence. What's the fourth indicator?
The fourth is a readiness to curtail the civil liberties of opponents and critics.
So going after the opposition, the media.
Exactly. Using the power of the state, or threatening to use it to punish dissent. Think about Trump's threats to open up our libel laws, to make it easier to sue news organizations like the New York Times or the Washington Post, or his attacks on Jeff Bezos, who owns the Post.
So taking these four together, it paints a pretty clear picture.
It does. And the authors note that populist leaders often check several of these boxes. Their whole appeal is often based on being the true voice of the people against a supposedly corrupt elite.
Which inherently denies the legitimacy of existing parties and institutions.
Right. They mentioned several Latin American examples: Fujimori in Peru, Chavez, Morales in Bolivia, Correa in Ecuador populists who won elections and then went on to weaken democratic institutions.
This leads to another key concept in the book, fateful alliances. This is where established political figures make a huge miscalculation.
Yeah, they think they can control an extremist outsider.
They invite them into power, maybe hoping to co-opt their movement or use them against other rivals. The book mentions Mussolini's March on Rome. He was actually invited to be prime minister.
Not exactly a revolutionary takeover.
No. And Hitler becoming chancellor in 1933. The conservative establishment thought they could manage him, push him into a corner. Famous last words, really.
History shows how badly that can backfire. But it's not inevitable, is it? The authors also show examples where gatekeeping worked.
Right, that's important.
They point to Belgium in 1936. The mainstream Catholic Party actually allied with its rivals, the socialists and liberals, specifically to keep the far-right Rex Party out of power.
Even though they disagreed on many things.
Exactly. And in Finland, in the early 30s, the political establishment united to isolate the extreme right Lapua movement. It takes real political courage to put democracy ahead of short-term partisan advantage.
And this idea of gatekeeping, it actually has deep roots in American history, surprisingly.
The founders were worried about demagogues, weren't they?
Deeply. They designed the Electoral College partly as a filter. Hamilton hoped it would prevent people with talents for low intrigue from capturing the presidency by appealing directly to popular passions.
Interesting. But that function shifted over time.
It did. As political parties grew stronger, they became the main gatekeepers. For decades, nominations were decided in, well, smoke-filled rooms by party insiders at conventions or in caucuses.
Not very democratic, maybe, but effective at screening people out.
Very effective. Figures like the industrialist Henry Ford or the populist Huey Long or George Wallace, all popular, but the party elites kept them from the nomination. So this raises a really important question. How did that system break down?
That's a key part of the story. The big turning point was the chaotic 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago.
Right, the protests, the clashes.
It led to reforms, specifically the McGovern-Fraser Commission, which pushed parties to adopt binding presidential primaries starting in 1972.
That threw the gates open.
Pretty much. For the first time, candidates could bypass the party establishment and appeal directly to primary voters. The power shifted dramatically.
Which brings us to 2016, and what Levitsky and Ziblatt call the Great Republican Abdication. Trump, they note, did terribly in the invisible primary. The race for endorsements from party leaders and officials, he was basically last.
Yet he won the primaries anyway.
He did. And the #NeverTrump movement within the party, while vocal, ultimately fizzled out. The crucial point the authors make is that most Republican leaders, despite their reservations, fell in line. They didn't make that decisive break, didn't endorse Clinton.
And Levitsky and Ziblatt speculate that if key Republicans had endorsed Clinton, prioritizing the perceived threat to democratic norms over party loyalty, it might have tipped the election.
A huge what if. So once an authoritarian leading leader is elected, how do they go about dismantling democracy? It's not usually a sudden move, as we said.
No, it's gradual and often uses legal tools. The authors outline three main strategies.
Okay, let's break them down. What's the first one?
First is capturing the referees.
Meaning the neutral arbiters.
Exactly. Judges, civil servants, intelligence agencies, tax authorities, election commissions. You replace impartial officials with loyalists. Hungary's Viktor Orban is a prime example, packing the courts and staffing state agencies with allies.
And this can be framed as necessary reform, right?
Absolutely. Remember Fujimori in Peru? He called judges jackals, claimed they were corrupt, and then seized control of the judiciary. It sounds like decisive action against a break-in system.
The authors argue Trump attempted some of this too, demanding loyalty from FBI Director Comey, firing him, publicly attacking his own Attorney General Jeff Sessions, battling the office of government ethics.
Yes, but they also know that in his first year, many of these efforts were, quote, derailed by Republican opposition and his own bumbling. So the capture wasn't complete, at least initially.
Okay, so capturing the referees is strategy one. What's the second?
The second is sidelining key players who might challenge the leader.
Like the opposition, the media.
And even business leaders who don't toe the line. It can involve buying them off, intimidating them, or finding ways to weaken them financially or legally.
The book gives that chilling example from Peru again, with Vladimir Montesinos literally bribing TV station owners and legislators. Millions of dollars changing hands.
It shows how vulnerable independent institutions can be to corruption and co-option.
And when it comes to the media?
Well, rhetorical attacks are part of it, calling journalists the enemy of the American people, but also threatening libel laws, suggesting using regulatory power against unfriendly companies. It's about creating a chilling effect, making critical voices hesitate.
Okay, referees captured, key players sidelined. What's the third part of the playbook?
The third is rewriting the rules of the game itself.
Tilting the playing field.
Precisely. Changing electoral laws, redrawing district boundaries, gerrymandering, altering campaign finance rules, making it harder for opponent supporters to vote.
The book uses the post-Civil War American South as a really stark historical example. Poll taxes, literacy tests, complicated registration, all technically legal, but designed specifically to disenfranchise African Americans and lock in white, single-party rule for decades.
A brutal illustration of how legal tools can achieve profoundly anti-democratic ends. Malaysia's long ruling party also used gerrymandering very effectively.
And the authors connect this to Trump's Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Led by Chris Kobach, it pushed for stricter voter ID laws and voter roll purges based on what the authors call false claims of widespread fraud,
which in practice tend to disproportionately affect minority voters and the poor, who are less likely to have the required forms of ID.
It's a subtle way to skew the electorate.
And there's another element here, how these leaders often exploit crises, real or even manufactured ones.
The rally around the flag effect.
No, exactly. A crisis, a terrorist attack, an economic downturn, civil unrest creates fear and uncertainty. People look for strong leadership. It gives the leader an opportunity to claim extraordinary powers, bypass normal procedures, and crack down on opponents, all in the name of security or stability.
Levitsky and Ziblatt list examples like Marcos in the Philippines faking bombings to justify martial law, Hitler using the Reichstag fire,
Putin using bombings in Chechnya to consolidate power, Erdogan in Turkey after the coup attempt. Crises are moments of real danger where democratic guardrails can be swiftly dismantled.
So all this points to the idea that constitutions, written rules, aren't enough on their own, right?
That's a central argument of the book. Constitutions are vital, of course, but they're always incomplete. They have gaps, ambiguities.
And they can be followed to the letter while violating the spirit, like a work-to-rule strike that gums up the works.
Precisely. You can use constitutional procedures in ways that undermine the very system they're supposed to protect. So what really makes democracy work, according to Levitsky and Ziblatt, are the unwritten rules, the norms.
The soft guardrails, as they call them.
Yes, and they highlight two absolutely crucial ones. The first is mutual toleration.
Just accepting that your political opponents aren't enemies.
Right. Seeing them as legitimate competitors in the political arena, even if you strongly disagree with them, not as traitors or an existential threat to the country.
They contrast the early U.S. Republic, where Federalists and Republicans genuinely saw each other as dangerous subversives, with later generations, like Martin Van Buren's, who learned, grudgingly perhaps, to accept legitimate partisan opposition.
But when that toleration disappears, look at Spain in the 1930s. Both sides saw the other as a mortal enemy. The result was civil war.
A complete breakdown.
It really raises the question. These norms, we often just assume they're there, right? But when they erode, the system of checks and balances starts to be used as a weapon.
Instead of a restraint.
Exactly. You get politics without guardrails, escalating constitutional brinksmanship. Each side pushes its legal powers to the absolute limit. That's what happened in Chile before the coup. The breakdown of norms invited disaster.
Okay, mutual toleration is one crucial norm. What's the other?
The second is institutional forbearance.
Forbearance, meaning restraint.
Yes. It's about not doing things you technically have the legal power to do, because doing so would violate the spirit of the system or provoke a crisis. Self-control, essentially.
Can you give some examples from U.S. history?
Sure. Presidents generally refraining from trying to pack the Supreme Court. FDR tried in 1937 and failed spectacularly, reinforcing the norm, or exercising restraint and using executive orders, even when frustrated with Congress.
Like Theodore Roosevelt holding back sometimes.
Right. Or the Senate historically showing difference on judicial appointments, approving the vast majority for over a century. And restraint in using impeachment. James Bryce famously called it the heaviest piece of artillery in the constitutional arsenal, not for everyday use.
So, tolerating your opponents and restraining your own use of power, even when legally possible. These are the invisible pillars.
Absolutely critical.
But the authors argue these pillars have been weakening in the U.S. for a while now, starting around the 1980s.
Yes. They point to figures like Newt Gingrich and his approach of politics as warfare, using really charged language, questioning opponents' patriotism, calling them pathetic or traitors.
This wasn't just rhetoric, though. It led to government shutdowns, the highly partisan impeachment of Bill Clinton in '98.
Which lacked the broad bipartisan support that previous impeachment inquiries had, violating that norm of restraint.
And the norm breaking accelerated after that, didn't it? Senate obstructionism ramping up, blocking judicial nominees under Bush, then the filibuster becoming almost routine after Obama took office.
Mid-decade redistricting in places like Texas to lock in partisan advantage. It became a pattern of pushing the boundaries.
The authors see the 2008 election and the Obama presidency as a real turning point, though.
A watershed moment, they call her, because that's when you saw parts of the conservative media and prominent Republican politicians really start to frame Obama not just as wrong, but as illegitimate.
Marxist, anti-American, secretly Muslim.
Sarah Palin talking about him palling around with terrorists. And crucially, the birther conspiracy theory, questioning his very citizenship, moving from the fringes right into the mainstream of the Republican Party, often enabled or even endorsed by party leaders.
That's a profound break with mutual toleration.
It is. Though it's worth noting, as the authors do, that President Obama also engaged in some norm breaking, particularly using executive actions more frequently when faced with relentless congressional obstruction on things like climate change or immigration.
So it becomes a cycle of escalation, tit for tat.
That's the danger.
So what's driving all this? Why the breakdown in norms?
Levitsky and Ziblatt argue the root cause is deep partisan polarization, and not just disagreement over policy, but something more fundamental, an almost existential conflict over race and culture.
The sorting of the parties.
Exactly. The Democrats becoming increasingly diverse, racially and religiously, while the Republicans become white and particularly evangelical Christian. This creates, they argue, a profound sense of status anxiety among formerly dominant groups.
And in that environment,
treating the other side as an enemy, as illegitimate, becomes politically potent, especially when amplified by partisan media. Breaking norms can actually be rewarded politically.
Which brings us back to the Trump presidency. The authors say his first year followed that electoral authoritarian script, trying to capture referees, sideline players, tilt the field.
But as we mentioned, they also say his most extreme moves were often blocked, partly by Republicans, partly by his own, lack of discipline.
So not much actual backsliding in terms of institutional changes in 2017, but he constantly pushed against the guardrails.
Like a reckless driver is the analogy they use.
But beyond those specific strategies, they highlight his broader norm breaking. Nepotism, like appointing Ivanka and Jared Kushner to high office. Huge conflicts of interest with his businesses.
The sheer volume of ethics complaints was unprecedented.
And especially his relationship with the truth. The constant brazen fabrications. PolitiFact rating nearly 70% of his statements as mostly false, or pants on fire.
And the relentless attacks on the press, enemy of the American people. Language echoing dictators like Stalin and Mao. Even tweeting that video of him body slamming CNN.
What effect does all that have, according to the authors, when norms are broken so publicly and repeatedly?
This is where they bring in Daniel Patrick Moynihan's idea of defining deviancy down.
Meaning we just get used to it.
Essentially, yes. What was once shocking and unacceptable gradually becomes normalized. The outrageous becomes ordinary. They point to things like political violence becoming more accepted. Representative Greg Gianforte body slamming a reporter and still winning his election the next day.
Oh.
Or the kind of militant language used in some NRA recruitment ads at the time, which the authors called dangerously politically deviant. It shifts the boundaries of acceptable political behavior in ways that can seriously endanger democracy over time.
Levitsky and Ziblatt make a powerful point. American democracy isn't somehow exceptional or immune. We've had catastrophes before the Civil War. the Jim Crow era.
And past stability often came at the terrible cost of racial exclusion.
Right. The full democratization that came with the Civil Rights Act in 1965, ironically, helped fuel the very polarization we're grappling with now. So, given all this, what's the way forward? How do they suggest defending democracy?
They offer several strategies, drawing lessons from history. First, and maybe counterintuitively, they say avoid fighting dirty. Don't mirror the norm-breaking tactics of your opponents.
Why not fight fire with fire?
Because it tends to backfire. They use the example of the Venezuelan opposition trying things like a military coup attempt, a general strike, boycotting elections.
And it didn't work.
No, it just eroded their own public support and gave Chavez the perfect excuse to label them as anti-democratic and crack down further. So playing by the rules, even when your opponent isn't, is crucial for maintaining legitimacy.
Okay, so resist the temptation to break norms yourself. What's the second strategy?
Second, build broad pro-democratic coalitions. And this means alliances, not among friends, but among adversaries.
So reaching across the aisle in a serious way.
Exactly. They suggest progressives finding common ground with, say, business leaders, maybe even white evangelicals, moderate or traditional Republicans, anyone who shares a fundamental commitment to democratic rules and stability, even if you disagree on policy.
Finding common cause based on preserving the system itself makes sense. What's the third suggestion? That sounds like a tough one.
It is. They argue the Republican Party must reform itself from within by actively marginalizing extremists, making a clear break from the Trump administration's, quote, authoritarian and white nationalist orientation, and finding ways to broaden its appeal beyond its current predominantly white Christian base.
They actually point to the post-war German Christian Democrats, the CDU, as a potential model.
Yes, a conservative party that explicitly rejected its country's extremist past and successfully built a broad coalition across religious divides. A difficult task, but they argue it's necessary for the health of the two-party system.
And finally, what about the Democratic Party?
Their advice for Democrats is to maintain their commitment to racial and ethnic inclusion. They strongly caution against trying to win back white working-class voters by compromising on minority rights or immigration.
Why is that so important?
Because doing so would be repeating the shameful mistakes of the past, particularly after the Civil War and during Reconstruction, where stability was achieved by sacrificing the rights of African Americans, essentially building democracy on a foundation of exclusion.
So inclusion is non-negotiable for a healthy democracy.
That's their firm conclusion, which really raises the final crucial question. How do we make sure these unwritten rules, these norms of mutual toleration and institutional forbearance, which aren't explicitly in the Constitution, how do we make sure they're actively defended? How do they become part of the American creed again?
Because ultimately, the authors argue, the entire system relies on them. The Constitution's strength depends on these invisible guardrails holding firm.
Exactly. They're the software that makes the hardware run properly.
So thinking about all this, what does it mean for you listening right now? If our democracy really depends on these soft guardrails, these unwritten rules, what role can each of us play? How can we recognize and uphold mutual toleration and institutional forbearance in our own conversations, our own communities, our own political engagement? How do we stop that defining deviancy down? Stop the unacceptable from becoming the new normal? It's about more than laws. It's about how we choose to engage with each other, even maybe especially when we disagree. Something to really think about.